So good morning. Let's get started talking about Windows Store apps, enterprise line of business app deployment scenarios. I'm not sure we could have came up with a longer title for that one. That barely fits on the slide. But basically what we want to talk about today is how to deploy apps to Windows 8. So in Windows 8, you have this new type of application. What is it? How does it work? How do we deploy it? How do we manage it? That's really what we want to talk about. And really, to get started into that conversation, we need to understand the terminology that we're using. So let's first start with some terms. First one is the term Windows Store apps itself. Initially, during the development process of Windows 8, there was a different term used, the M word. We can't say the M word anymore, but now have this challenge of just exactly what do we call these things. So Windows Store apps is generally what I'll use and how I'll refer to these, but you'll also hear them referred to in other ways. They'll be called WinRT apps. Well, WinRT, not to be confused with Windows RT, which is the operating system, WinRT is the APIs that are used to create these applications. So it's the WinRT platform, the WinRT APIs, so as a result, you create WinRT apps. You could also call them modern apps. They're modern, they're full screen, they're touch-enabled, they're fast, they're fluid, and it's just the typical Microsoft fluffy terms assigned to them. You could call them Windows 8 apps, because at this point, they only run on Windows 8. Well, what happens when they run on Windows 8.1 as well? So we have all of these terms. None of them are really a great fit, so okay, we'll stick with Windows Store apps for now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the apps are going to always be installed from the Windows Store. It's really just referring to the type of application, the style of application that we're going to be deploying. It can be deployed from the Windows Store. It can be deployed through other mechanisms. We'll also talk about Microsoft accounts. This is basically what used to be called a Live ID. We like renaming things, so Live IDs are now Microsoft accounts, but basically there's no changes otherwise. Microsoft accounts are necessary to go out to the Windows Store and install apps from the store. It's not necessary to install updates from the store. So if you already have an app installed, say the Inbox Mail app, and there's an update release for that, you can actually go out to the store and install the updates without logging in with the Microsoft account. But to install a new app from the store, you do have to log in. The Windows Store, if you haven't seen it already, is just the online store for acquiring Windows Store apps. It's also the name of the local app that's used in Windows 8 to connect to that online store. So you launch the Windows Store, you find the application you want, you click to install it. This does require, as we already said, a Microsoft account to do that. You'll hear us talking about AppX files. So AppX files are really the packaging format for Windows Store files, kind of like MSI files were in the past. An AppX file, though, isn't quite as sophisticated as an MSI or as an old setup.exe. It's really just a zip file. If you wanted to see what was inside of one of these AppX files, you could actually rename it to .zip and then double-click on it in Explorer, and it would open it up and show you the contents that are inside. Basically, it's all the files necessary for the application and an XML manifest file that describes what is this application, what does it require, what's its name, what's its version. All of the details about the application are actually stored in this XML file inside of the AppX file. So when it comes time to actually install an application, an app like this on Windows 8, it's really just going to take that AppX file, extract the contents into a folder, and then register that app into the operating system, which happens just by reading the details out of the XML file and creating an entry in the OS. So not a big surprise that installing these is very simple and very fast. They get downloaded, they get extracted, they get registered, done. There's no custom actions, there's no code being executed. It's really just download, extract, register. Sideloading then is the process of installing or provisioning a Windows Store app without going through the Windows Store. So we talked before about downloading and then extracting and then registering. Well, we're going to skip the downloading part. We have the AppX file somewhere. We're going to just tell the operating system to install it or to provision it, which will cause it to extract the contents and register it with the OS. When we start talking about line of business apps, these would be apps that you would develop yourself for your own use inside of an enterprise. You could put those into the Windows Store. But if you put an app into the Windows Store, anyone can find it. Anyone can install it. So generally, if it's a line of business app that's specific to your business, you're not going to want it in the Windows Store. You're going to want it in a private enterprise app store. So we'll talk about how to set one of those up as we get into this. So that gets us more into the kind of the breakdown of what's going on behind the scenes. First, we need to talk about installation. Installation of Windows Store apps happens per user. So if I log into a machine and install an app and then log in as a separate account, that app won't be there until I install it again for that second user. Now, Windows is smart enough to make sure that it does single instance storage of the file, so it's not going to have multiple copies of the application around, but it does have to actually be installed for each user before it's usable by that user. It is always per user. It doesn't require any administrator rights. It can be done from the Windows Store, obviously, and it can also be done via side loading. Again, side loading is the process of installing from any location other than the Windows Store. The installation process, because it's per user, actually means you can be running different versions in different users. So I could log in and install the newest version from the store. Another user who hasn't yet installed the latest update could be running a different version. So you could actually see in the file system multiple extracted versions of this application. And Windows will automatically manage those. So as soon as all of the users have moved off of an older version, it will clean up the older files. It will automatically delete the folder that was extracted when the original version was registered with the OS. So it's kind of self-maintaining. You don't need to worry too much about what's going on behind the scenes with that. The second scenario then is provisioning. And provisioning is a little different. Provisioning is designed to solve a different problem. What if you wanted to include an application in your operating system image and make it available to every user? We just got done talking about installation's a per user thing. So provisioning is just a process of registering an app with the operating system, telling it to automatically install this app for every user the next time they log on. So if installed Windows 8, you've noticed that the first logon takes a while. You log in, it displays the animation that tells you how to use the Windows 8 UI, how to use the charms, how to swipe, how to click, depending on whether you have a touch-enabled system or a non-touch-enabled system. And then it displays the colorful background screen saying, hold on, we're preparing Windows for first use, we're installing applications, we're doing stuff. That stuff is basically this provisioning process. There are a set of apps included in the operating system by default. There's about 15 of them. Those have to be installed at first logon because they've all been provisioned into the operating system image. If you wanted to, you can add your own provisioned apps into the operating system. You can add up to 24 additional applications. So this is useful if you're creating your own custom images and you want apps to be available to all users. But it's not something you can just really go crazy with because there can be a maximum of 24. Why 24? No idea why 24. Apparently it was better than 23 and 25. That's about the logic that was used. It's really tied more to the OEM limits that were put in place. They didn't want OEMs to put in too many little apps when they ship a new machine to you. So they had to put a limit in place just to keep OEMs from going overboard, but those same limits then actually transfer into the enterprise space as well because you're subjected to that as well. So right now, 24, you can maximum provision that number. While you could provision apps to an already deployed OS, most of the time we would suggest that you only look at this as something to do in your imaging process. So include provisioning apps in your image, but kind of only as that first time login experience. For new apps that you want to deploy those new apps via an enterprise app store using a management tool like System Center Configuration Manager or Windows Intune. The capabilities are a little different between the two. We'll talk about those a little bit more as we get into this. Maybe you want to push an app out to users. Well, Config Manager can do that. Maybe you just want to enable pull. Well, either of them can do that. So depending on how you want to get these applications out to your existing users, to your existing computers, you may need to look at the functionality that's offered. So as far as provisioning goes, the process that you would use to provision an app into your image is not too bad. You can run PowerShell commands or DISM commands. DISM.exe has some command line options to do that as well. You just have the AppX files, you run the commands, you sysprep the operating system, you capture the image. Easy enough. When it's deployed, everything else just works. So we'll look at that and see how to do that. Usually what people want to do in addition to that, though, is also customize the start screen layout. That can be done as well, but there are some additional steps required to do that. So provisioning apps, we can do that with MDT. Provisioning of apps, well, we don't really do that with Configuration Manager. So how many of you build images? How many of you build images with Configuration Manager? A couple of you? So if you were to run a task sequence in Configuration Manager, or really in MDT for that matter, and you installed an app, where would it be installed? It would be installed for the currently logged on user. Well, if you're talking about MDT Light Touch, the currently logged on user is the local administrator account. So the local administrator account could run the app, but no one else could. Well, that's pretty useless. So you could do the same thing with Config Manager. You could try to run the commands to install an app as part of a Config Manager task sequence. Config Manager task sequence runs as local system. No one can ever log on as local system, so no one would ever be able to install that app. I think it'll actually fail if you tried, but generally installation doesn't do any good as part of a task sequence. Provisioning does do some good. MDT has built-in functionality to do that provisioning for Light Touch. So if you're using MDT Light Touch to create and capture an image, that'll work okay, and we'll look at how to set that up. If you're doing Config Manager, it doesn't have any provisioning capabilities built into it, but there's no reason you couldn't add a custom run command line step that executed the necessary DISM command to provision the app as part of a task sequence before you sysprepped and captured a WIM that you intended to then deploy later to many machines. So we've talked about side loading. In the case of installation, that can be done from the store or from via side loading from a location other than the store. Provisioning is a sideload only operation. Provisioning, you can't say, I want that app from the Windows Store to be provisioned into my operating system. Because in order to provision, you need the AppX files. In order to provision, you have to have the system enabled for sideloading. So now we need to get into the discussion of, well, how do we enable a system for sideloading? Because it's not done by default. There are some requirements that you need to meet. One is a simple group policy. There's a policy that needs to be set to allow all trusted apps. That's a simple registry key, no big deal, easy to set. Second one is whatever certificate is used to sign these AppX files needs to be trusted by the operating system. Doesn't matter what certificate it is, it just has to be rooted off of a trusted root certificate that's already on the system. So let's say your developer routinely goes into Visual Studio, they create a new app, they compile it, and they hand it to you. If they used a certificate that was generated by your internal certificate authority to sign that app, and you've already deployed the trusted root cert as part of your group policy, no problem, that's already satisfied. But if they're not a very knowledgeable developer and they don't know about certificates issued by the internal certificate authority, and instead they use one generated by Visual Studio, a self-signed certificate, that self-signed certificate won't be trusted by Windows. So now you would have to take that self-signed certificate and import it into the trusted root store of the computer that you're deploying the app to before the app would actually run. That would work. That's not a particularly scalable solution because you really don't want to fill up your certificate store with a bunch of these self-signed certs. So there is a bit of developer education that may go along with this to tell them, as you're building your application, please acquire your own code signing certificate from our certification authority internally. Place that into your Visual Studio project and use that when you're building your code. It's not a big deal overall. You just need to be aware of whatever certificate was used to sign this. It needs to be trusted. So that's the second requirement. The third requirement is the more challenging one if you're not running Windows 8 Enterprise. If you're running Windows 8 Enterprise, it's not too bad. Just join it into Active Directory, the requirement's met. Windows 8 Enterprise, domain joined, automatically enables sideloading. Windows 8 Enterprise in a workgroup, Windows 8 Pro, or Windows RT require the installation of a separate sideload product key. Well, where do you get this sideload product key? If you have software assurance for Windows, it's on the Volume License Service Center. You can go out to VLSC, search for Enterprise sideloading, you'll find the key, you install it just like you would install a Mac key, which if you're installing it manually, you just run slmgr.vbs/ipk and then the product key and then /ATO to activate it. Not too bad, easy enough to do. You can automate that, push it out via Config Manager. If you're deploying using Windows Intune and Windows RT computers, Intune will actually automate that process. You can import the sideload product key into Intune and it'll take care of deploying it automatically. So that's great if you have software assurance for Windows. You get the sideload key automatically. Let's say you don't have software assurance for Windows. Most of you, if you have software assurance for Windows, you have rights to run Windows 8 Enterprise, and you would be running Windows 8 Enterprise, and this whole discussion wouldn't matter. So if you don't have software assurance for Windows, then you have to buy the sideload product key. Sideload product key is sold in packs of 100 activations. So it kind of works like a Mac key, but it's not really a Mac key. It's a feature key. So you would have to buy a 100 pack. I think the going rate is about $3,000 for a 100 pack, so about $30 a machine. You get the key, you install it on each computer, and it enables that computer permanently to install sideloaded applications. So there is that barrier to entry to do this sideloading. But once sideloading is enabled, then you can sideload install as many applications as you want. You can sideload provision up to 24. It doesn't allow more than that. So then we get into the discussion of the Enterprise App Store. The Enterprise App Store is focused on installation, not on provisioning. We don't really want or encourage you to have a management tool for pushing out new provisioned applications. We want to reserve those 24 slots for things you want to put in the image and have available to everyone as part of the image. For everything else, we'll set up an Enterprise App Store and push out installs to the existing machines. Like I said before, we can do that with Configuration Manager. We can do that with Windows Intune. If you don't have either one of those, you can do it yourself using simple PowerShell commands. So let's say you're running another third-party management tool. As long as it has the ability to run a command line in the context of the currently logged on user, that can be done. So you can use whatever management tool you want to build up an Enterprise App Store, because really it's just it's running a PowerShell command to install that app for the currently logged on user. So that's what we want to start with. Let's look at doing this the hard way. So let's assume that you don't have Configuration Manager 2012 SP1, or you don't have Windows Intune that provides kind of the automation around this to make it a little more simple. Let's say you wanted to do this with PowerShell. from a learning perspective, it's useful to understand kind of the inner workings of this anyway. So we'll start off with that and look at how this works with PowerShell. If I can get past my sign-on screen here. So I have PowerShell up and running. Let's see if we can make that a little bigger. There are commandlets built in to ask the system about the currently installed and the currently provisioned apps. So on this particular machine, I can do get appx package. And it will give me a list of all the packages that are currently installed for the logged on account. So let me just select name to give it a little prettier list. If we scroll through this list, we can see kind of the expected things. We can see Bing and news and Reader and photos and sports and music and just the standard apps that you would expect to find in Windows. So that's the installed list. If I do get appx provision package minus online, because I want it from the currently running OS, not some offline OS somewhere, that will give me a different list, well, potentially different list. It will give me the list of provisioned applications that were included in the operating system image when it was deployed. This is really just the standard list that's inside of Windows 8. That list will actually get longer with Windows 8.1. We're adding additional inbox applications, so don't be surprised if this grows over time, but that's the current list. That's 24 in addition to the inbox ones. It'll still be 24, so you won't have slots taken away from you because Microsoft decided to include 5 or 6 more. So not a problem. There'll always be 24 open slots for you to make use of. So the first question that people usually ask is, well, I want to build my own custom image, and at this point, well, I don't have any additional apps that I want to add in, but I really don't want games in my image. How do I get rid of some of these? So it's easy enough to do. I can say get appx provision package to get the package that I want to remove. Maybe I wanted to filter that somewhat, and I needed to do some more PowerShell to actually do that. But in this case, I'm just going to say get them and then remove them. Now, first I need to say online, and then pipe that whole list into remove appx provision package online. So we'll run that, and that will attempt to remove all of the inbox apps. I say attempt because there'll be a few that fail. There are exactly 3 apps in the operating system that can't be removed. One is the Windows Store. It can be disabled via group policy, but it can't be removed. The second is the PC settings, the modern control panel. It would kind of suck if you couldn't configure Windows because you just got done removing the control panel that you use to configure Windows, so we don't let you remove that one. And the third one is the modern Internet Explorer. But it removed everything else. If I do get appx provision package now and specify online, which I always forget, now it shows that we don't have any. Well, there are actually still some there, but it's just not going to show them to you. So what would you expect the start screen to look like now? I've removed all of the provision packages. Is it going to look fairly empty? Let's find out. It's completely unchanged. All the apps are still there. That's because the apps were provisioned when I logged on. And at logon, it saw that this list of provisioned apps needed to be installed, so it installed them. The fact that I deprovisioned them doesn't cause them to get removed from existing user profiles. So if I want them to actually go away, I need to uninstall them. I can do that from PowerShell as well. So if I get appx package here, that shows me the list. That list is still there. Then I can do remove appx package, and that will uninstall all of them for the currently logged on user. Some of them will generate errors because they're getting removed out of sequence. There are dependencies between them. Some of them will generate errors because they can't be removed, like the Windows Store. But most of them will successfully get deleted. And at that point, we end up with a very plain-looking start screen. So at this point, you can even tell from the start icon that pops up that there's only 3 icons left on this screen. The desktop, which isn't really an app, it's just an icon. Internet Explorer, the Windows Store that we can't remove. And then the third one that I referenced is actually what you get when you click on Settings and click on Change PC Settings. That's the third app. Makes sense that you can't remove that because it's really required to configure things. So then you end up with a subset of the apps. Now, you're probably not going to remove all of them. At least we hope you're not going to remove all of them, although there's nothing preventing you from doing this. But you may want to remove just a few of them that aren't applicable for your particular environment. Games, maybe some of the Bing News, Bing Sports, who knows what you might want to remove, but any of the inbox apps can be removed that way. Now let's say you wanted to provision an app of your own. So you have an internal line of business app and you want it to be available to every user in your environment. How do you provision an app into the operating system? Not surprisingly, we have an add appx provision package command. And with that, we need to specify online again for the current OS. We need to specify skip license, basically to say that we know that a license is available for this application. And then we need to specify the package path for the app that we're looking to install. So I think I've got one out here on server. I have to remember the path. I think the network path changed on me. Helps when your virtual machine is on the right network. There we go. So I've got one here. Let's just do rounds, and then the name of the appx file. So rounds underscore whatever, any CPU, debug, appx, that's kind of the typical generated name that you would see out of Visual Studio. Name of the app, the version of the app, the fact that it can run on Intel or ARM, and the fact that it's a debug package. But .appx, that's the install file that I need. At this point, I tell it to add it, and it comes back with an error. It says to add an app package by using the skip license option, you must enable the allow all trusted apps policy setting on a Windows edition that allows sideloading. For more information, see this link. It's amazing how much progress we've made over the years with creating error messages that are actually useful. That one actually tells you exactly what you need to do. So in this case, I just happen to have that registry key in a file, which I can import. TOSO, management, source, allow, all trusted apps.reg. So we'll import that, and just to show you what that looks like. It really is just a very simple policy. Allow all trusted apps, set it to 1, and now it should succeed in provisioning that application. So we'll run that same command again. Add AppX provision packages, online skip action, skip license package path. And then we should have the application provisioned. Won't take too long. Always seems like it takes a few seconds longer than you always expect it to. But once that's done, now the application is there and available for every user. But now we're not going to actually see it show up on the start screen because I'm already logged on. If I were to log out and log back in again, then it would show up. Might take it a couple of seconds because that happens asynchronously in the background, but it would show up as a new user logs on. So the provisioning process just makes it available. The installation is a separate step that would happen later. If you wanted it to show up right away, you could just manually install it right after this command finishes. You could put in another command to say add AppX package and install it for the current user. Okay, so it's provisioned. If I logged out, log back in again, it'll show up. But at this point, we still have a very blank start screen that has 3 icons on it. So let's go ahead and do the add AppX package. And then specify that same path. If I could type. And it comes back with another error. This error says deployment failed with the H result, whatever, a certificate chain process, but terminated in a root certificate, which is not trusted by the trust provider. Okay, basically it's telling me that the certificate used to sign this particular application isn't trusted by Windows. Well, I said before that developers who don't necessarily know how all this stuff works would use a self-signed certificate in Visual Studio to build this app. What you would see when that happens is a certificate file in the same folder as the AppX file with an extension of .cer. So that's the self-signed certificate that Visual Studio generated for you. So I can work around the fact that I'm dealing with a clueless developer here by registering that certificate. I can do it manually. I can also do cert util. I always forget what the command line options are for cert util, but basically I need to import the key, add store, then the store I want to put it into. I want to put it into the root certificate authority store, and then specify the file name. Okay, and it confirms that root is trusted root certificate authorities. Yes, that's where I want it. Signature is okay, the certificate's okay, so add completed successfully. All right, now let's try to install it again. Now we get a different error. Deployment failed with H result. Dependency or conflict validation. Windows cannot install package because it depends on another package, requires a minimum version of that other package, etc., etc., etc. So apps can have dependencies. And in order to install the app, you have to install the dependencies as well. So again, if we do a directory of that particular folder containing the application, where did that command go? If we do a directory, we can see there's a folder here called dependencies. Again, this is the normal way that Visual Studio builds an app. It creates a dependencies folder, puts all the dependencies into that folder. So if we do a directory of dependencies, we can see that this app has one dependency, Microsoft.WinJS.1.0. Now normally that app, that dependency would be present in Windows because that is one of the standard dependencies that's pre-installed in the OS, but I removed it when we removed all of the installed and provisioned apps because it wasn't used anymore. But it's easy enough to put back. So when we say that we want to install the app X, we also can specify a dependency path and then specify the full path to that dependency. So you end up with some rather sizable command lines here, but not too bad overall. So here it will first install the dependency, then it will install the main package, and now we have the new application installed. When we go here, we see rounds is present. I click on rounds, and it says it can't run. Well, why can't it run? Well, there are actually two reasons in this case. One is that I'm on Windows 8 Enterprise in a work group. I didn't join this computer into Active Directory, so sideloading hasn't been enabled. I could install a sideload product key, and that app would then work fine for most users. I'm also logged on as a local administrator account. There are challenges with running modern apps on the local administrator account. We really don't want to encourage you to use the local administrator account for those types of things. You could work around that if you really wanted to, but basically this is the type of error that you would get to tell you that sideloading hasn't been enabled. Question?
Yeah, no, I think you already answered this, but I just want to be sure. I've not been able to figure out a trick from PowerShell to say, I'm person X, and I want to install for person Y. Is there any way at all to say, I'm Joe, I want to install it for Mary?
I don't believe that's possible. You can query the apps for another user, but I don't believe you can install for another user without using something like PSExec or something that could load a user profile for the other user and inject it that way, but that's not something I've tried either and probably wouldn't be supported. But if we do help add appx package, there is no user option on this. You can just specify path, 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 no user. But if you look at get appx package, I hate that. Hit the wrong key and now it's in insert mode. There is a user option on get appx package. So I can ask for the list of apps for another user, but I can't actually install them for another user.
You mentioned we'll see that change. And the only reason I ask is that I'm thinking that, the PowerShell tools are great, but this is one thing missing. I mean, I want to be able to hand Jane a machine where everything's already ready for her. And it feels like we can't do that.
Yeah, I haven't had that discussion with the platform team that's built this because I've never heard that request, but that would make sense. Yeah, it would be nice to be able to install for another user to push out those apps, which would enable you to even have Config Manager or something like that do it without having the user logged on. Sure.
Once you install a package on the machine, but that package doesn't get installed for each user, does it?
It does. So yeah, I'm now logged on as the local administrator account. There is another account on this machine. If I switch over to that other account, what do you think I'm going to see? And this is kind of a trick question because it depends. Did this account ever sign on before or not? If it logged on before, it's going to have all of those provisioned apps. If it's never logged on before, well, it's going to install the currently provisioned apps, which would mean the new Rounds app that we provisioned would show up. Well, it had obviously logged on before, so all the old provisioned apps were already installed. Now, if you were paying attention, initially you didn't see the rounds icon over on the right. It took a few seconds because that background provisioning process kicked in and saw, oh, there's a new app that I need to install for this user that isn't yet present. So that's the way it would work for another user. Once you provision that app, it will actually show up. It's installed, but it's still not going to run. So that's the distinction here, is you can actually see this little X on the icon, which means, yes, this application is installed, but it's not going to work because this machine hasn't been enabled for side loading, and Windows knows this app was side loaded. So if I click on it, I'm going to get the same error. This app can't open. There's a problem with it. It doesn't really tell you what the problem is, but it is, in this case, the machine's not enabled for side loading. If I joined the domain right at this point, it would work fine. So yes, it's not a permanent problem. That's actually what you would expect to see as you're building an image. It's harmless. You just can't run the app until you've deployed it and joined it into the domain. Well, you would just make sure that MDT is provisioning the app, which is the only thing that MDT knows how to do with these, rather than installing them. Installing them would accomplish very little. Provisioning them would be useful because then they would show up when the image is deployed or when the user logs on. So let me go ahead and log out. I think my network connection is missing. Let's hope it recovers. We'll see if it reconnects, but then we want to look at one other thing, which is the next challenge that most people run into. If you don't completely understand what's going on behind the scenes here, you might think that I can log on as a local administrator. I can launch the Windows Store. I can go out and find Link and Skype and Reader Touch and OneNote, and I can install them and then run sysprep. And then when I deploy it, I would expect all of those apps to be available to every user. Nope, it's not going to work that way. In fact, it actually is worse in that sysprep will fail. There's no way to sysprep an OS with apps installed from the Windows Store. It's actually a little more nuanced than that as well. The rule really is there can't be any app installed that isn't provisioned on the machine. So the fact that I de-provisioned all of the built-in applications and have the apps installed on that demo account will cause sysprep to fail. If I were to run sysprep on this OS at this point, it would blow up. It would log an error, and then it would come up with a message on the screen saying sysprep failed.
What about if you're running sysprep audit? Install Windows, immediately start sysprep audit, install everything you want, and then come out of audit mode, then image your machine.
It wouldn't fail, but it wouldn't accomplish anything either. Because audit mode is going to run effectively in the context of the administrator account, and installing apps for the administrator account is not going to really do you any good. Now, you could provision apps in that state. You could boot into audit mode, do the provisioning, and then reseal it. That would work okay. But if you read through the documentation that's on TechNet that talks about some of these provisioning scenarios, they do talk about using audit mode, and that's kind of the scenarios that were in mind when that documentation was written. But enterprises never use audit mode. Well, 99% of enterprises never use audit mode. Occasionally people do, but it doesn't really solve the problems that we've been talking about, but it does properly work in that scenario where you just wanted to poke a few additional apps in and then reseal it and then deliver it to a user. You would think it would be just about the same to do it that way. However, there's a little got you on offline injection of AppX files. When you provision or install an app online, you use the AppX file. When you do it offline, you use what's called a flat folder structure. Well, what's a flat folder structure? I finally gave up and had to ask the developers, how do you create a flat folder structure so that you can inject this offline? They said, you have to extract the contents of the AppX file into a folder and then point to that folder. Ooh, why would I want to do that? So they didn't build the ability in the offline injection to actually support using AppX files directly. I'm not quite sure what the logic is behind that, but most of the people that have tried to do that offline injection just kind of pulled their hair out and said, yeah, it's not worth the trouble, I'll just do it online.
So I would take the AppX file, make it a zip file, unzip the file into the folder structure, and then use that.
In theory. Now, I haven't actually tried that, but that's what they've said would work. I'm not 100% sure how that works from a certificate validation perspective, because the AppX is what was signed with the cert. When you extract the contents, it's no longer signed with the cert. So my guess is that means there's no longer any cert verification that goes with that offline injected app, which seems like a flaw. Not a big deal for the inbox apps because, well, they're inbox, but a bigger problem for things you're getting from third parties. It's a bad thing about using a remote desktop back to your office is people do weird things with the gateways in between, and suddenly you find you don't have a connection anymore. So let me log off as this demo user, log back on as the local administrator. So let's assume that you're kind of the old-fashioned type and you've manually built an operating system image, you've installed the OS, you've manually provisioned apps, and you've removed some of the built-in provisioned apps, and now you want to sysprep it because you're ready to capture a new WIM file. So you would go to Windows, System 32, sysprep, and you'd run sysprep.exe. /sysprep.exe. Say that we want to do ubi, generalize, and quit, which are reasonable options if you're doing this manually. We say OK. Now, first it's going to fail to tell me I need to reboot because there are pending Windows updates. But even if we rebooted and tried this again, it would fail and say that there are installed applications that aren't provisioned. Now, there aren't for the currently logged on user, but for that other demo user, yeah, there are still apps installed that aren't provisioned on this box. We would need to actually remove those apps or just blow away that user in order to successfully sysprep this. So we could go ahead and restart and try again, but trust me, it'll fail. And there is actually a KB article out there that describes that failure, because it usually is the first thing that people try is, I want to include additional apps from the store. How do I do that? Well, step number 1, get the AppX files. Step number 2, provision it into the image. Well, they don't do step number 1, so they can't do step number 2. The problem, though, is something that we'll get into in subsequent slides, talking about kind of the frequently asked questions. How do you get the AppX files? So let's say you want to include Skype in your image. We would love for you to include Skype in your image. Well, you would think we would love for you to include Skype in your image. So you pick up the phone, you call Microsoft, and you say, can I have the AppX file for Skype? And the support person politely tells you, sorry, no, we can't provide that. Get it from the store. Okay, so your only option is to instruct your users to each go out to the Windows Store, log in with a Microsoft account, search for Skype, and install it. We can shortcut that a little bit with the enterprise app stores, with Config Manager and Windows Intune. We can actually build a deep link and we can push that deep link out to the machines. That deep link can say, automatically launch the store, navigate to the page. But the user still has to click the install button, because the install button accepts the EULA for the application, and then the app installs. We recognize the challenges in that whole scenario. We're still trying to work out a good system for dealing with that so that enterprises could build up a proper internal app store with the install files. The OEMs have the AppX files. So it's a little different scenario there. If an OEM were to pick up the phone and call Microsoft and say they want Skype, here you go. In fact, we probably have some OEM agreements with some of the OEMs that require that they do that. So it's a different set of rules when we're talking about OEMs. There are much different arrangements in place for that.
Also, the user has to click the install button, but he also has to have a Microsoft account.
He has to log in with the Microsoft account and click the install button. It doesn't have to be linked with the currently logged on account. The store will prompt and have you log in right then and there, but yes, you do have to specify a Microsoft account before you could install that app from the store. Okay, so that's the manual scenario. So the main things to remember out of that, because I'm sure you won't remember most of that, but still, you have to meet the prerequisites. We need to set the Allow All Trusted Apps policy. That's a simple registry key. You can import it or set it via group policy. You need to import any needed trusted root certificates, easy enough to do, and you have to enable sideloading somehow. Very easy for Windows 8 Enterprise Domain Joined, requires installation of a separate sideload product key if you're using anything else. Hopefully none of you are using the Windows 8 Core SKU, the one that ships on new PCs that don't have Pro, because that doesn't support sideloading at all. So in order to enable sideloading, you would have to first upgrade that to Pro, and then you could enable sideloading using a sideload product key. We looked at the PowerShell commands then to manipulate the installed and provisioned AppX packages. There are also dism.exe command line options if you wanted to provision using dism instead of PowerShell. But personally, I prefer the PowerShell commands because they're much easier to remember. When you can just hit tab to complete the next parameter. DISM, you have to remember whatever the long command line option is in DISM to add an AppX provision package because it's just slightly different from the PowerShell syntax. So now let's shift into the configuration manager world. So most enterprises have configuration manager in place. How would you use configuration manager to deploy apps? So if we switch back over to my machine here, I can go to my config manager server. Into the config manager console. And as part of the application management capabilities in Config Manager 2012 SP1, it has the concept of applications. These applications are of a variety of types. Traditionally, you've used MSIs, you've used AppV, you've used setup.exes, you've run scripts. All of those are options. The newest option, though, that was added in SP1 was the ability to install an AppX file. So when we say we want to create a new application, instead of specifying something like a Windows installer, there's now an option to install a Windows app package, a .appx file. That is the sideloading operation that we were just doing. It's a per-user install. So how? You just need to specify the appx file, and it will take care of the other details. There is the second option here, Windows app package in the Windows Store. That's the deep link that I was referring to before. It's kind of like a shortcut. It points to the store app so that when Config Manager pushes it out, it just causes it to navigate the store to that point, and the user clicks the install button. If you try to do this, this is one of those interesting UI choices that I don't actually have set up, so I can't show you the full thing. But if I click Browse here, it asks me to connect to a computer running Windows 8 so that it can query the computer to find a list of apps that are installed, and then I can pick the one that I want to create the deep link to. So the first step in order to create a deep link in this manner is to install the app on a machine. Second step is now you can select it. What isn't obvious, unless you actually read the documentation, is that in order to connect to that remote machine, WinRM has to be enabled and configured on that remote machine. So you need to go to the Windows 8 computer, open an elevated command prompt, and type WinRM quick config, which will set up the firewall rules and services in order to make that connection. If you don't do that, you'll never get this to work. But I don't happen to have a Windows 8 domain join machine that I could easily connect to do that. But simple enough once you get past that point. Let's do the AppX file option here, where I'll browse to exactly the same AppX that I was using before, this rounds package. I can select that and click Next. Now, it's able to open up that AppX package and get all of the app details out of the XML file. So the XML file describes the app itself, so we really don't need to type in anything else. We can just click Next. All the details about the application name, manufacturer, version are already pre-populated, and it's created. So there's not any more to it. Everything is set up. All we have to do is deploy it. To deploy it, we right-click and say Deploy, and we choose a collection. Now, because Config Manager is going to do an app install, the collections you're going to see are user collections. You target a user because it's going to install per user. Remember, we said these apps always install per user. While you could change over and try to say, give me a device collection and target it to all systems, it's probably not going to have the desired results. I'm not exactly sure what that would end up doing, but generally you want this to be a user collection. Generally, maybe you want to make it available to everyone, in which case you can say all users, or if you had additional user collections defined, you could limit it to that list of users. You remember back when we were installing the AppX manually, we had to also install the dependencies, that dependent WinJS application. Config Manager automatically found that dependencies folder, and it took care of that for us, so we don't even have to worry about that. Config Manager will automatically install the dependencies. Intune, same thing. It'll automatically take care of the dependencies, so you don't need to worry about those. Now, unfortunately, MDT, if you were to provision the app, doesn't know what to do with the dependency, so you would have to install the dependency and then install the main app before it would actually work. Easy enough. So then we need to deploy the AppX file to a distribution point. So we'll choose my DP. We wanted to make it available to install. And we can say either available or required with Configuration Manager. So available just means that you can request it from the app catalog. Required would be push it out to the user and don't even ask. So we'll make it available. We could say that it requires administrator approval, and then you as the Config Manager admin would need to approve the request. We'll skip that for now. We can take all the other defaults and then we're done. So we now have the Rounds app added into the list. If I switch over to a client machine, I should be able to see that app and request it. So I have my Config Manager client. If I go to the Software Center, which is a Config Manager utility, from there I can actually click on the link to open the application catalog, just to save me the trouble of going to the URL directly, because I don't like typing in Contoso MGMT CM application catalog, which would be the full URL. We can then see all of the available applications that have been published to me. So it knows who I am. It's automatically identified me and identified all the apps that target me. including this brand new one that we added for rounds. And I can click Install. It will kick off the installation request and pretty much in real time do the install. Now, in order for this to succeed, those prerequisites that we talked about would already need to have been taken care of. Config Manager is not going to do that for you. So you would need to enable the policy, you would need to import the trusted root certificate, and you would need to make sure that the system's been enabled for sideloading. Obviously, Config Manager can automate those steps, but you would have to do that using a task sequence, using a package and program, using some scripting, some automation to take care of that. Software installation is complete, so it installed successfully. So we at least took care of the allow trusted apps and their certificate requirements, otherwise we wouldn't have gotten that far. And there's no little X on it, so obviously I'm running either Windows 8 Enterprise Domain Joined or I've installed a sideload product key. This is actually Windows 8 Enterprise Domain Joined.
Is Configuration Manager part of 2012 server, or is that an add-on product?
It's an add-on product, so System Center, the suite, is there's several products in it. Configuration Manager is one of them. Configuration Manager is included in the core CAL. So if as part of enterprise agreement or a select agreement, you acquire the core CAL, which gives you Windows Server CALs and what else does it generally include? Configuration Manager, Windows Server, and a couple of other things. You would have access to it. Yeah, so generally check your volume license agreement, check your select or enterprise agreement. Most enterprise customers have Configuration Manager licensed, even if they don't have it deployed, because it's included in the core CAL. So now the app is installed, we don't have a little X, we can actually launch it, and it runs just fine. That's only because I took care of the prereqs before doing this. Otherwise, yeah, we'd have a little bit more work to do, but it's not too bad. If you use, say, a common certificate or a common root authority at least, so that you don't have to be worrying about certs all the time. If you were to be bringing in third-party AppX files and each one of them used a different certificate, that would be okay if they all got them from VeriSign, because then you could import a VeriSign root certificate and all of them would be trusted. So you just need to pay attention to the trusted root certificate. If we were to actually go over to the server here again and find that AppX file, and open up the properties in Explorer, there is a digital signatures tab here where we can actually see what certificate this was used with or was used to sign it. And if we look at the details, if we see an error here, that means that this certificate isn't trusted by Windows. We could then just go ahead and import it, but generally you want this to not display any errors. I think I've got some other apps here that are appropriately signed. I don't think this one is either. Yep, yes, this one is. So this one was signed with the Microsoft Corporation Internal Use Only certificate. So this is our internal certificate authority. The software developer signed this AppX file with that certificate, so everything's okay. It is actually possible to even re-sign an AppX file. So if you get an AppX file from a vendor that was signed with the self-signed Visual Studio generated key, you could feed it through your own certification process and re-sign it with your own cert. That would work okay too. Okay, so with Configuration Manager, you would build out this list of applications, and on each of these applications, you can specify a category. I let it default in this case. I think it ends up in an other category by default, but you can specify whatever categories you want. So you can put in a name of the category, maybe medical apps or something like that. And then you'll be able to see those categories inside of the actual web page. All right, so that's not too bad. You can build this out. It can continue to grow over time. You can have a single level of categories. You can't actually have nested categories, but generally that's okay. That works okay for us internally. The challenge right now is that it's a web page. The web page is not too bad when you're using a keyboard and mouse, but when you're using a touch-based tablet, touching some of those entries on that web page isn't much fun. So the goal over time is to move that from being a web page to being a Windows Store app. So there will be a Config Manager company portal app available in the Config Manager 2012 R2 release that's going to be out in beta by the end of this month, that will work with Windows 8.1 to give you a touch experience rather than the web page that we looked at before. We'll see what that app's going to look like in a minute, but that's because that app is already in use by Intune. Intune has a company portal app today that has that touch interface. That exact same app is going to also be used with Config Manager. So the app knows how to talk to a Config Manager infrastructure when it's internal. It knows how to talk to an Intune infrastructure when it's being used with the cloud management. Okay, let's switch back for a sec. So in the case of, did I go forward or did I go back? The case of Config Manager, we need to remember that the Config Manager app model is really encouraging you to deploy apps to users, not to do provisioning. They purposely didn't add provisioning support into the product because they don't want you to do it. They want you to have this view of the world that's entirely user-centric, that users go out to a web page or in the future use the company portal app to request and install applications. Deep links can be used. You just need to keep in mind that the user still has to log in with a Microsoft account and click install. So if you intend to disable the Microsoft Store, then deep links aren't going to work. This does require Config Manager 2012 SP1 for Windows 8, and it will require Config Manager 2012 R2 for Windows 8.1. Sure.
Is there a way to build a deep link without Config Manager? Is it just registry entry?
It's really a URL. So you can build a URL that if you clicked on this URL, it will launch the store and take you directly to it. There is actually documentation out on TechNet that explains how to build that URL. But you can actually see that in Bing. So you go out to the Bing webpage and search for an application name that you know. And it will find it in the web version of the store and show you a link in the web results. And when you click it, it'll launch the store and take you directly to it. So if you view the source, you would think that you'd be able to figure it out by viewing the source of the web page, but it's buried inside of JavaScript, so it's really confusing and hard to find. But there is documentation on how to do that. It's not that bad overall. The hardest part is coming up with the app ID, which is what needs to be part of that URL, but the web page does actually help with that. PowerShell can give that to you as well. It's actually much easier in Windows 8.1 as well because you can do, there's another commandlet, get-start apps, and it'll list all of the apps that are currently on your start screen, including the app ID for each one of them. So that's Config Manager. Now in the case of Intune, it's really not that different. We're just going to be using a different management infrastructure and it's slightly different behavior. So let's look at how Intune would be used to create the same type of experience. Actually, I want to be in the same machine here. Intune's admin console is web-based. So we would come into Intune, we'd log in, and probably as soon as I click on something here, it's going to ask me to log in again. Session's timed out, so I need to re-authenticate. Sign me in. And I've navigated to software. So step one would be add software. So I click on that link. It runs a .NET application that's just a wizard to walk through this process, which will take a few seconds to launch, and it may ask me to sign in again. It's just the nature of the fact that this is a .NET app that's separate from the web page. So I'll log in one more time. And the next thing it'll ask me for, again, is, well, what type of app are you looking to add? And then where's the AppX file? So again, I have choices for software installation, Windows installer, different types of app packages. They have a new one at the end for a Windows app package, .appx file. And I need to browse to a location that has those. Demo apps, rounds, select the AppX file. Again, it knows how to deal with the dependencies, so it will take care of the dependency automatically, but it doesn't know how to get the details of the app out of the AppX file. So it doesn't get the publisher, it doesn't get the version, it doesn't get the name, so we had to type that in. Not quite sure why Config Manager did it and Intune didn't, but hopefully they'll address that in an upcoming release. Then for description, maybe it's just, this is my app. There are some pre-built categories available in Intune. I could say that this is a business app, and it would then show up in the business category. If I had an icon, I could set an icon on it. You can do basically the same things in Config Manager as well. When we click the upload button, it'll take all the files that are necessary, which would be the AppX for the app and then the dependencies. It'll bundle them all up, encrypt them, and then upload them into Windows Azure. So Azure is used for Intune's distribution point storage. That upload process, as soon as it's done, makes the app available. The next step is to deploy that application. So we would deploy that app and target the users that we want to deploy it to. Hopefully this doesn't take very long, or we can walk through those next two steps fairly quickly. Okay, it's been uploaded. Step 2, manage the deployment. Here we just see the list of apps that we have available. Fortunately, I've done this a few times, and you can see the different versions of it that I have out there. This one from June 4th is the new one. I can right-click, say Manage Deployment, choose All Users, add it, click Next. The approval option, the only one available through Intune, is make it available for install. You can see required install is grayed out because Intune doesn't currently support pushing Windows Store apps. That's something that may be available in the future. For right now, it's just available. So that's been approved. Let me go ahead and delete these others, otherwise I won't know which one's which. And then we can switch over to an Intune client. When you install Intune, you install the Intune agent, and you can have it install the company portal. Here I can launch the company portal, which is that modern UI experience. And from there, I can see the applications that are available. I can also see the categories. So we can, re-sign in so that it's not complaining about that. And we should be able to see the categories once I've logged in, including the fact that I put that application into the business category. So there's the Rounds app. I can click on Install, and it will take it from there, assuming the other requirements have been met. So I've enabled the policy, I've enabled side loading, I've deployed the necessary certificates. All the other side loading requirements need to already be met. So we have to do all of those steps that I just listed. We need to publish the apps. Users can pull them. There's no push. Windows Intune, because it needs to know about all the user accounts, has to be set up with directory synchronization between your on-site Active Directory and Windows Azure Active Directory. So there are some additional overhead releases for that. It does require the latest Intune release that came out in January, so that shouldn't be a problem at this point. Most people have been upgraded. Now, one last thing before we wrap it up is MDT. If we do this with MDT, we're now not talking about installation, we're talking about provisioning. So we would be looking at the task sequence. So the first thing that we would need to do in MDT is say that we want to create a new application with source files. Oh, yes. Helps if you can actually see what I'm talking about. So we can create a new application, call it Microsoft Rounds. We need to point to the source folder. eSource, demo apps, rounds. And then for the command line, this is kind of the worst part of it, we need to specify the name of the AppX file, which there's no way I'm going to type because I would mess it up, but I can copy and paste into that wizard the name of the AppX file. So MDT knows when it sees that AppX file as the command line that, oh, this is an app that you want me to provision. And instead of just executing the command line as specified, it'll build the much longer DISM command line to provision that application into the OS. Now, I mentioned before that it doesn't handle the dependency, so we would need to do this again for the WinJS file, and then say that this new Microsoft Rounds app is dependent on that WinJS app, and it would take care of provisioning both of them, but it's just another extra step. We could then select that application when the task sequence executes, or we could explicitly put it into the task sequence. Either way would work, doesn't really matter. So if we went into a Windows 8 task sequence, we could go to Custom Tasks. We could add a new step to install an application, install a single one, and then browse to the new app that we created. And that would take care of provisioning that app into the operating system so that it would then be installed automatically for each user when they logged on. So that part's not too hard. Question? Does it have what? A switch for dependencies? Right, it doesn't today. That's one of the things that's missing, so you would need to set up the dependencies separately. We're hoping that that's something that will be fixed here in the next release. I'm not sure if they're going to get to it or not, but there's just a missing option in the command line to do that. So MDT focuses on that image creation scenario. It can provision apps in the image. There is a limit of 24 of them. There is more documentation on the Deployment Guys blog and on TechNet on how to do that. You can't install apps from the Windows Store before sysprepping, so don't try it. And this does require 2012 Update 1. Anyone could build their own app store, so maybe you don't use Config Manager, maybe you don't use Intune, that's okay. You can do this using your own PowerShell commands. You could even build your own Windows Store app to install other apps. It is kind of tricky because the WinRT APIs to install Windows Store apps can't actually be called from a Windows Store app. It's the weirdest restriction ever, but there are workarounds, and if you look at the company store project out on Codeplex, it actually implements some of those workarounds where you have a modern UI app that shows you the list of applications, and then when you click on install, it starts another process to actually run a desktop app that installs the application that you selected. So it's a good sample to show you how to do that type of thing, but you can use any software distribution tool that you want to run the same PowerShell or DISM commands that we looked at, running as the user for installation, running as an administrator if you're going to be doing provisioning. As far as the frequently asked questions, yes, you can customize the start screen layout. If you saw the keynote demo yesterday, that's actually getting simpler in Windows 8.1. It was a little hokey with Windows 8, but it's getting better. Getting the AppX files, yes, that is a bit of a challenge. We're trying to work on that. You would have to talk to each ISV to see if you could get the AppX files for them. There is a way to disable the Windows Store completely, but you can't selectively control what they can see and what they can't. If the Windows Store is available, you can't say, I only want them to install productivity apps and not games. You could use App Locker in Windows 8 Enterprise to whitelist or blacklist, but that doesn't prevent you from installing them. It prevents you from running them. So there is the ability to keep them from launching, but they've already paid for it and installed it, and now they won't be able to launch it, so that probably won't go over very well. Windows Store is currently disabled on Windows to Go in Windows 8 because there is a 5 physical device limitation on Windows Store licenses. That particular problem will be fixed in Windows 8.1. We'll increase that limit drastically to the point where it's basically unlimited. You can get the sideload product key from the Volume License Service Center. We already talked about that. Easy enough to find. There are some issues with other apps, like the Mail app does require a Microsoft account as well. We are working on that. We expect that to be fixed in Windows 8.1 as well. So you'd be able to run the Mail app and connect to Exchange directly without first connecting to an Outlook.com account. There is no way to programmatically install an app from the Windows Store, but you can get these deep link URLs and use those to at least navigate to the point where you just need to click the install button. There are definitely issues with proxy servers, especially authenticating proxy servers. There's a couple KB articles that talk about those challenges. You'll run into those if you try to install apps from the Windows Store and you're sitting behind an authenticating proxy. And that is it, which is good because I'm about 5 minutes over time. So hopefully that was a useful overview of kind of the nuts and bolts of how this works and then how to set it up with Config Manager, with Intune, with MDT to set up that enterprise app store. So now when you hear us talking about needing an enterprise app store, hopefully you know what's going on. Thanks for coming. Please fill out your evaluations. If you have any other questions related to this, I'll be up front. Just stop up front and we can take care of those others. Thanks.